Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. We always have our UPSC aspirants in mind, and today is no different. If you're focusing on international relations, this one's especially for you. Actually, this deep dive is fascinating for anyone who's, well, interested in how the world works, really.
Yeah, I agree.
Today we're tackling human rights in global politics. It's a topic you see everywhere in international relations, and let's be honest, it's a bit of a favorite in the UPSC exam, too.
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because, for a long time, people thought human rights were just a domestic issue, like something that happened inside a country's borders, and that was it. But over the last century or so, it's become a global thing. It impacts everything from foreign aid to how countries deal with conflicts.
Exactly. And our source material really highlights that tension. The tension between a government's responsibility to its own citizens and its obligation to uphold these universal human rights.
Right.
It's a tough balancing act, I imagine. So how does that actually play out in the real world,
Right.
in the world of global politics, I mean?
Well, it creates this push and pull. On one hand, you have this idea of national sovereignty, the idea that each country is free to govern itself without interference from the outside. But on the other hand, there's this growing sense that certain rights are just so fundamental, so universal that they go beyond borders.
Mm. So our moral compass is expanding, so to speak.
Yeah, it is
I like
say,
that. And the source material uses this term, cosmopolitanism, to describe this shift. Can you break that down for us? What does cosmopolitanism actually mean in this context?
well, at its core, cosmopolitanism is the belief that every human being is morally equal, that everyone deserves respect regardless of where they live or what passport they hold. It's like we all belong to one big human community.
It's a citizen of the world kind of thinking. I like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the philosopher Thomas Pogge, he actually defines cosmopolitanism using three elements. Individualism, meaning the focus is on individual people and not just groups. Universality, which means these moral principles apply to everyone equally. And generality, which means everyone deserves equal concern and respect from everyone else, not just from their fellow citizens, but from everyone.
Okay, so for our listeners, especially those aiming for top ranks in the UPSC exam, how can they apply this concept to real-world scenarios, the kind of situations they might encounter in the exam, I mean?
Well, it means you can't analyze international events by just looking at the politics or the economics. You need to factor in the human rights angle as well. So think about it like this. Let's say there's a conflict happening somewhere in the world. You need to ask, how does India's stance on that conflict reflect its commitment to upholding universal human rights? Or how do human rights considerations influence India's decisions on foreign aid? Things like that.
Those are great examples, especially for our UPSC folks.
Hmm.
Really thinking about those real-world applications is key to understanding how this concept actually works in the messy world of global politics. And speaking of understanding, our source material has this really helpful table that outlines 3 generations of human rights. I love a good framework, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. It's a fantastic way to see how the concept of human rights has changed over time. So the first generation, which came about during the Enlightenment period, focuses on civil and political rights. These are the freedoms we often take for granted, like the right to life, liberty, free speech, and a fair trial, the really fundamental stuff.
Right, the basic building blocks of a free society. And you see these laid out really clearly in documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, specifically Articles 3 through 21.
Yeah, exactly.
But then, as the world became more and more interconnected, a second generation of rights started to emerge, right?
That's right. The second generation is all about economic, social, and cultural rights. It's about making sure that everyone has a decent standard of living and that we're promoting equality.
Yeah.
So this includes rights like the right to education, health care, social security, and even things like paid holidays.
Right.
Articles 22 to 27 of the UN Declaration touch on those. And then there's the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which goes into a lot more detail. And these rights came about because people started realizing that having basic freedoms wasn't enough if you couldn't actually access the things you needed to live a dignified life.
That makes sense. You need the foundation, but then you need the rest of the house too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then on top of those two, we have the third generation, the newest category of rights. These feel especially relevant to the kind of global challenges we're facing today. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The third generation is all about solidarity rights. These are rights that belong to groups or even to humanity as a whole, things like the right to self-determination, the right to peace, to development, and even to a healthy environment.
Okay.
And we see these rights reflected in documents like the Stockholm Convention on the Human Environment and the declarations from the Rio Earth Summit. This third generation really reflects that growing awareness of our shared responsibility for the planet and for each other's well-being. It's actually really fascinating how the idea of human rights has expanded to include these big global concerns.
It really highlights how interconnected our world is and how much we rely on each other. But, we have all these declarations and covenants outlining these rights. But how do we actually ensure that they are upheld on a global scale? And that's the real challenge, isn't it?
It is. That's where we get into the development of what's called the international human rights regime. This is the whole system, the institutions, the laws, the norms that have emerged since 1948. And it all started with the UN Declaration. It's been this fascinating journey, often frustrating, but fascinating nonetheless, going from putting these ideas on paper to actually putting them into practice.
It's like having a blueprint for a house, but needing the construction crew to actually build it. And that sounds like a story we need to unpack a bit more. So join us in our next part as we explore how this regime actually works, or sometimes doesn't work, and who the key players are in making it all happen.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. So as we were saying, that journey from declaring human rights to actually enforcing them, well, let's just say it's complicated. There's a lot that needs to happen to bridge that gap.
It's like we have the blueprints for this amazing house, but no construction crew to build it. So how do we go from just wanting these rights to making them a reality? What are the actual mechanisms in place?
Well, it all starts with the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But here's the thing. It's not actually a legally binding treaty in itself.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's more like a set of standards, a moral compass for the world, something countries should aim for.
So more like a guiding document then, a set of aspirations rather than
Yeah.
hard and fast rules.
Exactly. But even without being a law, it's had a huge impact. Think about it. Before 1948, the idea that a global organization could tell a country how to treat its own citizens,
Yeah.
that was radical. The Declaration really challenged the idea of state sovereignty. It basically said, hey, what happens inside your borders isn't just your business anymore. The world is watching.
That must have really shaken things up. It's like a new player entered the game of global politics, one that's all about these universal values. So how did the UN go about actually turning these principles from the Declaration into real laws, enforceable laws?
Well, that's where the two international covenants come in. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And together, these two covenants, along with the Declaration, they form what's known as the International Bill of Human Rights.
Ah, okay.
These covenants, they take the principles from the Declaration and they flesh them out into specific legal obligations for the countries that ratify them, at least.
Okay, so now we have the laws, but who makes sure the countries actually follow them? Who are the referees in this global game?
Right. Well, a lot of that responsibility falls on the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Human Rights Council. The High Commissioner, their office acts as a sort of watchdog, you could say, for human rights around the world. They keep an eye on what's happening, investigate any violations, and issue reports to highlight abuses.
So they're like the investigators. And the reporters, I guess, bringing these violations to everyone's attention.
Yeah.
But do they have any real power? Can they actually enforce anything? Or is it more about naming and shaming?
Honestly, yeah, a lot of it is naming and shaming. They can't really force countries to do anything. It's more about diplomacy, public pressure, and hoping that countries actually care about their international reputation.
So it all comes down to reputation in the end. That's interesting. And what about the Human Rights Council? Where do they fit into all this?
Right. So the council, it's made up of 47 UN member states, and their job is to address human rights violations around the world. They can investigate, they can condemn, and they can make recommendations to the General Assembly.
That sounds pretty powerful. Are they effective in actually bringing about change?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest. You see, the council itself, it doesn't have any enforcement power. So their recommendations, they have to go through the General Assembly. And the Assembly can only advise the Security Council. And as we know, getting the Security Council to agree on, well, anything can be pretty tough.
That's putting it mildly.
Right. And plus, the council itself, it's faced some criticism. People say it can be politically biased and not always consistent in how it deals with abuses.
I see. So navigating the UN system is a delicate dance, to say the least. But, our source material also mentions these non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. And they seem to play a pretty big role in all of this. How do they manage to make a difference? They don't have any real political power, do they?
They don't, but they're crucial when it comes to monitoring, reporting on, and advocating for human rights. Think about groups like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. They're out there documenting abuses, getting people talking about it, and putting pressure on governments and corporations to do better.
It's amazing the influence they have without any real political power. It really shows you the power of just getting the information out there, making people aware. Does the source material give any examples of the impact they've had?
Oh, yeah, tons. They were really instrumental in getting the Declaration on Torture adopted in 1975. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, NGOs were all over that. They also played a key role in the push for the Landmine Treaty in 1997.
Wow, so they're not just raising awareness. They're actually shaping international law. That's really impressive. But I imagine it's not all smooth sailing. What are some of the challenges they face?
Well, they can't force governments to do anything. And when it comes to the Security Council, where the real power lies, their influence is pretty limited there. And sometimes they're criticized for focusing on issues that are more popular or that will get them funding instead of addressing the less visible but equally important human rights violations. But you can't deny that they make a huge contribution.
Definitely. It's a really complex system with all these different players trying to advance human rights on the global stage. But our source material also points to the European model as a bit of a success story. What makes it stand out from the UN system?
Well, the European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR, it's seen as one of the most effective regional human rights systems in the world. And what sets it apart is that it's actually enforceable. The European Court of Human Rights, which is based in Strasbourg, France, they can hear complaints from individuals and they can issue rulings against states that violate the convention.
So there are actual consequences for countries that violate human rights within that system.
Exactly. And get this, the compliance rate with the court's verdicts is really high, like around 90%. You don't see that in the UN system very often. It really shows you how effective a well-designed and enforceable regional system can be.
There's definitely a lot we could learn from that model. But before we wrap up, we need to talk about the different perspectives on human rights and global politics. Because, let's be real, not everyone agrees on the importance of human rights or on how they should be protected.
You're absolutely right. There are lots of different viewpoints and some healthy debate going on around this. You have the realists, the liberals, the critical theorists, all looking at this topic through their own lenses. It's kind of like looking at a painting from different angles. You get a totally different appreciation for it. So let's dive into those different perspectives when we come back.
Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. So we're in the final stretch of our exploration of human rights and global politics. And in this last part, we're going to get into those different perspectives we mentioned. Those different schools of thought that approach human rights from all these different angles. Yeah. It's really interesting how people can look at the same thing and come to such different conclusions, right?
It really shows you how multifaceted human rights are as a topic. So why don't we start with the realists? They're known for being a bit skeptical about the role of morality in international relations. For them, it's all about power, national interest, and security. They often see human rights as, I guess you could say, a secondary concern, sometimes even a distraction from what they consider the real game of nations.
So for them, it's all about might makes right, like survival of the fittest on a global scale.
In a way, yeah. They believe that states, countries, will act in their own self-interest first and foremost, and that they'll only really uphold human rights when it benefits them strategically.
That's a pretty different view from those who, believe in the inherent goodness of humanity and all that.
Right.
But speaking of those who believe in a more idealistic vision, that brings us to the liberals. They seem to be at the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to human rights. So what's their take?
Well, liberals are the big champions of human rights in global politics. They believe in the inherent dignity and worth of each individual, no matter where they come from. And they see promoting human rights as a moral obligation, not just something you do when it's convenient.
So for them, it's about creating a more just world, a world where everyone has a chance to live free from oppression.
Exactly. They tend to view international relations through a more cooperative lens. They believe that countries can work together to create a better world for everyone.
Okay, so we have the realists who are more about power and self-interest, and then we have the liberals who are more about cooperation and these universal values. But Our source material also mentions some critical views that, well, they challenge both of these perspectives. And they bring up some really interesting points. Can you tell us more about those critiques?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main critiques comes from the global justice movement. They argue that the traditional human rights framework, with its emphasis on individual rights, well, it doesn't go far enough. They want to see a more radical change, like a redistribution of power and resources, both within and between countries, to really tackle inequality and make sure everyone has access to basic necessities.
So it's not just about protecting individual liberties, but also about addressing the underlying systems that create and perpetuate these inequalities.
Exactly. And then you have the feminist critiques. They point out how the traditional human rights framework, which, let's face it, was mostly designed by men, often fails to address the specific experiences of women.
Right.
Things like violence against women, discrimination, reproductive rights. Those issues are often overlooked or downplayed.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that human rights are not just some abstract concept.
Yeah.
They have very real implications for people's lives. And those experiences can be very different depending on your gender, race, background, all of that.
Absolutely.
These different perspectives are so important to consider when we talk about human rights. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Right. And understanding all these nuances and different viewpoints is, well, it's crucial for anyone, really, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there. You need to be able to analyze these different approaches,
Yeah.
think critically about them.
This has been such a fascinating dive into the world of human rights in global politics. We've gone from defining what they are and understanding how much influence they have to exploring how they're actually protected or not protected sometimes. And now we've looked at all these different perspectives on how they fit into the world. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And it's clear that human rights are this powerful force that influences how countries interact with each other, how they deal with global issues, and even how we think about our responsibilities to each other as, well, global citizens.
For our dedicated UPSC aspirants, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to grasp all these nuances. It'll really help you tackle those tough international relations questions. But for all of you listening, I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this complex and fascinating topic, human rights on the global stage.
And this is just the starting point. We encourage you to keep digging, explore those sources, and really think critically about what you're learning. Oh, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this episode with your friends, family, anyone who might be interested in exploring this topic with us.
Until next time, keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.